Let's start with a graphical representation of an export subsidy, and let's assume for this example that we're talking about a small country which does not have any impact on the world price. Suppose the country starts an autarky. That means that it has no trade, and so the domestic demand and supply intersection point, or the equilibrium, determines the price in autarky. Then this country opens to trade and finds that the price in the world is higher, which means that the domestic suppliers will want to produce and export this good outside the country. So the point at which this new price meets the demand curve, domestic demand curve, represents the quantity demanded. The point at which the price intersects with the supply, domestic, represents the domestic supply that producers will produce at this price. So the difference between QS1 and QD1 will be the exports. But let's say the government wants to support the local producers and impose an export subsidy. Since this is a small country, it will not have effect on the price. So the new price with the subsidy will just be higher than the world price just by the amount of the subsidy. So this distance is actually that subsidy amount. The price now is higher than before, and so the domestic consumers are not happy, and they respond with lower quantity demanded. And the domestic suppliers are happy, and they respond with a higher quantity supplied. So you can see now that the new exports are higher. So QD2 is the new quantity demanded at home for this good. QS2 is how much the domestic producers are producing, and the difference between QS2 and QD2 represents the new exports. We can also show that an export subsidy leads to social losses in a small country. Let's calculate consumer and producer surplus and total surplus in autarky, with open trade, and with a subsidy. Starting in autarky, remember that every time we try to calculate the consumer surplus, we must be very clear about where is the price that we're talking about. So here, the price in autarky is this. This is our price line. So the area above the price and below the domestic demand curve represents the consumer surplus. It's this triangle here, which represents the area ABC, F, G, H. The area below the price and above the domestic supply curve represents the producer surplus. That is the area J, K, L. So altogether, this whole area, consumer and producer surplus, represents the total surplus. Suppose now the country opens to trade. It's important to remember what the price is now. Price is PW with open trade. This is the price line that we're talking about. Now, what is the consumer surplus now? It is lower. Consumers are not very happy with this higher price. So it's just ABC, which means that the area FGH has been lost. What about the producer surplus? Producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve. So it's this large triangle here. So now the producers actually have retrieved, they gained that FGH that was lost by the consumer surplus, but they also gained a new area, I. So the total surplus is the sum of these two areas, and apparently there is a social gain, which is this triangle I that was not in the surplus before. Now suppose the country decides to impose a subsidy to help its local producers. The price is now even higher. It's PW plus subsidy. It's this line over here. What is the consumer surplus? It's the area above the price line but below the domestic demand curve. So it's very tiny. So it's lost B and C from before. At the same time, the area of the producer surplus is quite large. It's the area below the price but above the supply curve. But somebody has to pay for this subsidy, and that is the government. So the government has to pay subsidy. It's the amount of the subsidy, which is this distance, times the amount of the exports, which is this distance right here. So the government pays CDE. And so when we combine the total surplus, we find that there is a social loss that occurred. So the social loss that occurred from the subsidy is area C and area E. Area C is because let's go over what happens to an export subsidy when this is a large country. Once again, we start with the open trade PW and the original exports, which is the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded domestically. When a large exporting country implements an export subsidy, it causes an increase in the price of the good in the domestic market, but also it causes a simultaneous decrease in the price in the rest of the world. So after the subsidy, the price in the exporting country, it's the country that we're talking about, rises to PW new plus subsidy. The price in the importing countries falls to PW just because there's more of this exported good out there. So now the new exports are higher, but the domestic demand is lower. Remember that with the import tax in a large country, there was ambiguous change that could happen. So there could be a loss or there could be a gain. Unfortunately, with the export subsidy, even in a large country, it will lead to social losses. Let's show that. So if we started in autarky, remember that our price would be equal to PA, price in autarky, which is this price line here. And so the area above the price and below the domestic demand curve represents the consumer surplus. The area below the price and above the supply curve represents the producer surplus. And the total surplus is the sum of the two. Now suppose the country opens to trade, so the new price is PW, and the consumer surplus is the area above the price but below the demand curve, so it's this triangle here. So it lost the areas F, G, KLM, but the producer surplus is now higher, and that's the area below the price above the supply curve, so it regained areas F, G, KLM, but it also gained a new area I and N, which represents the social gain. Now suppose the country decides to impose an export subsidy. So P new plus subsidy is our new price line. And the consumer surplus is the area above the price and below the demand curve, which is A. So it lost even more area. The producer surplus gained a lot of that area and more. So it's the area below the price above the supply curve. However, the government actually paid for a lot of that export. So they paid the amount of the subsidy, which is the difference between P new plus subsidy and PW new, times the new exports, which is this distance here. So they paid CDE, GIJ. If we put the total surplus together, we find that there has been social loss. The social loss is equal to area C, area E, and GIJ. So this area here. So this area in magenta represents the social loss from this export subsidy.